Welcome, everyone, to Real's final parent speaker series talk of this school year. We're so excited to have these amazing speakers here to learn about curiosity, connection, and confidence, a new path to motivation for 2E kids. Spanish interpretation is available on the separate channel at the bottom of your Zoom. In case you're not familiar with Real, we are a nonprofit located in Silicon Valley that ensures twice exceptional students thrive in school by raising parent awareness through events such as this and educator awareness and understanding of practical research-based strategies to address their needs successfully. And just in case, if you're here, you're probably familiar with twice exceptionality, but just in case, we use the Bridges definition, which thinks about kids as having a yellow portion that is their distinguishing strengths, high abilities or potential in one or more areas. And at the same time, the blue complex challenges such as dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and others that combine to create a green learner. And you have to support both sides, both the yellow and the blue simultaneously, which leads to a complex learning profile, which can confuse both parents and educators. And that is why we started a nonprofit to support this population. Real provides a lot of free services for parents. We have an expert speaker series like you're attending tonight. We have a bi-monthly parent support group that meets on Zoom, and it's meeting this Thursday. We also have a Google group with over 1,000 parents in it, asking and answering each other questions from like, where can you find a math tutor, to my child's burned out in school, what do I do? We have downloadable parent toolkits on a variety of topics that I'll show you in a second, and many online resources like downloadable IEP guide, downloadable guide to getting your child assessed, a schools list of local Bay Area schools you might consider for your learner, and as well as some online that are all over the country. The only two things that have a fee are our small facilitated learning groups and our one-on-one consultations if you need more personalized support. Our parent toolkits and guides are free downloadables. If you just got a diagnosis, or if you just discovered your child's 2E, or you want to learn how to support their strengths or how to work with your school, we have a bunch of different guides that you can download. We also work with educators. We do custom professional development. Most of our educators are interested in our learning difference simulations, where they get to experience firsthand what it might feel like to be in the classroom with learning differences, as well as our vignette workshops, where we work through stories of actual students and how to support them. And we have a lot of recorded talks, online resources, and an educator newsletter that you can sign up for. Real has created an educator model that you can also download for free that talks about how developing connection, embracing flexibility, attending to strengths, and reframing behaviors can help twice exceptional and all students in the classroom, and give specific examples in grades K through 12. We are, as I said, wrapping up our winter spring event series. So this is the last, but you can watch recordings of all the previous ones on our YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, we have a support group on May 7th that you can join as well. And soon we will be announcing our fall speaker series, so stay tuned. And here's how you can follow us on socials, watch our recordings on YouTube, and join our Google group. And Callie's putting a bunch of these links in the chat for you. And so now I'd love to introduce our speakers for tonight. We're so excited to have this group. So Gustav Steinhardt is a lecturer at UC Berkeley, where he teaches courses on behavioral science, biological anthropology, and the human brain. His extensive teaching history includes designing and leading Diversities of the Human Brain, the first combined neuroscience and neurodiversity studies course in the UC system. Courtney Edman is the founder of Tame the Shame Incorporated, where she provides coaching, education, and advocacy for neurodivergent children, young adults, and their families. She helps parents and caregivers develop strategies, skills, and confidence to support twice exceptional learners, and co-hosts the See Me podcast. Courtney also delivers trainings, webinars, and guest lectures on giftedness, twice exceptionality, and neurodiversity-informed and affirming approaches to raising, teaching, and coaching athletics and extracurriculars kids of all ages. Elizabeth Cobb is a neurodivergent parent educator. Her career has been a study of how people inhabit systems, from studying cultural anthropology and architecture at Princeton and University College London, to helping launch a startup acquired by Oracle, to managing editorial projects for global design firm Gensler. She brings this integrative approach to neurodiversity, helping parents and educators connect neuroanthropology to their everyday experiences. And Teresa Nair, our Reels Parent Community Services and Program Manager. She is a dedicated educator and business leader with nearly 3 decades of experience across education, nonprofits, and high tech. She holds a master's in cognitive diversity in education and a certificate in twice exceptional education. As a neurodivergent individual and parent, Teresa brings both lived experience and research-informed insights to her work at Reel. She leads a team of advisors supporting our one-on-one consultations, facilitates Reel's small group discussions, and helps guide Reel's online parent community, ensuring families feel informed, connected, and supported every step of the way. So I will let Gustav Steinhardt take it from here.
Thanks, Yael. Let me make sure that my slides are shared the way I want them to. This always goes very well in the prep, and then when it's live, something always goes wrong. I've been teaching on Zoom for a while. Okay, all right, how does that look? Okay, good. So, we're going to be talking about motivation. When we talk about motivation, that is the dopamine story. That is the story of dopamine. In particular, dopamine is what makes the connection between motivation and motor action. So it's one thing to have the abstract state of I want to or I don't want to. It's another thing to actually move your muscles, move your body, do the things that you need to do in order to achieve the thing that you're motivated to do. So I want to think of these things in a continuum. I think we intuitively, we tend to distinguish between problems of motivation, problems of I don't want to, versus problems of motor control. We sometimes think of a motivational problem as something to do with a person's personality. It might be kind of a moral failing if somebody's not motivated in the way that we want them to be, whereas a motor control issue, nobody sort of moralizes about that, or nobody says try harder if what you have is a motor issue. What I want to try to convince you of is that these things exist in a continuum, that there really is no line neurologically between I don't want to and I can't. And this is the story of a number of different brain structures, which I won't really go into too much detail about, but really it's the story of dopamine and dopamine functioning in different areas of the brain. So if you know nothing else about dopamine, you probably know that it's associated with repeated behaviors, rewarding behaviors, food, scrolling on your phone, gambling, drugs, all kinds of things that are reinforcing that you kind of, ooh, I like that. I would like to do that again. That's dopamine. It's pretty clearly involved in ADHD. So if you're familiar with ADHD medication, Adderall is one that people will swear by. They'll say that it changed their life. It's chemically very similar to dopamine. So if ADHD, as we think, is an issue in the dopamine circuitry of the brain, Adderall is addressing that. Dopamine's also involved in autism, although for reasons that are less clear. These are some recent papers from the last few years kind of suggesting that there may be a link between dopamine and autism. But you'll find this again and again, that when it comes to ADHD, we've got a pretty decent idea of what's going on at the neurological level. When it comes to autism, we really don't. Autism is so many different presentations, probably caused by many different underlying neurological phenomena. ADHD is a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more narrowly defined. So dopamine is involved in both ADHD and autism, but much more clearly involved in ADHD. I want to point out just a few areas where dopamine is important. And the reason I like to go to the neuroanatomy here is because sometimes people will say things like, oh, I just got a hit of dopamine from that cat video that you sent me. It's really not the dopamine itself. It's where the dopamine is going. And dopamine does very different things in different parts of the brain. So some of the major targets, the nucleus accumbens is probably the big one. This is the one, I mean, when people say I got a dopamine hit from that cat video, what they mean is I got a hit to my nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is where you get that rewarding sensation, the sense of, oh, I want to do that again. You also see a lot of dopamine activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is where planning happens. It's where what we think of as executive function, the ability to kind of lay things out in a linear way and say, okay, I have this goal, here are the sub goals, here are the tasks that I need to do, and then execute on those tasks. That's all happening in the prefrontal cortex, and that also depends on dopamine. Less talked about is the fact that dopamine functions in a structure called the striatum, also called the basal ganglia. The distinction doesn't really matter. Treat those as synonymous. The striatum is what's involved in rote memory. So riding a bicycle or playing an instrument, the alphabet. If I ask you whether J comes before or after K in the alphabet, you probably kind of back up a few steps and go B, B, C, D, J, K, and then you remember. It's that repeated action, that thing that you do over and over again until it sticks in your brain. That happens in the striatum. The striatum also chooses motor activity. So when I want to do something, I have to coordinate my muscles to reach out and do it. I also have to inhibit all the other possible things that I could do. So if I'm thirsty and I want to reach out and grab a glass of water, I have to inhibit all the other, I could flip the table upside down. I could stand up and run around screaming, I'm thirsty. There are 1,000 other things that I could do that I don't do. And that's because the striatum is turning the volume down on all those other things and saying, don't do that. That's not a good idea. Do the thing that we've decided to do. So all of these things, again, exist in a continuum, and it's a continuum driven by dopamine. The nucleus accumbens is the area that we've probably known about the longest in terms of dopamine circuitry. So there's the famous Olson-Milner experiment where the rat was hooked up to an electrode, which was stimulating the nucleus accumbens. The electrode was hooked up to a little bar, and the rat could step on the bar and cause a little bit of electrical activity. When you hook up a rat up like this, the rat will just push on that button over and over and over again, basically until it passes out from exhaustion. It'll choose button over absolutely anything else that you can give it. Button is better than food, it's better than sex, it's better than cocaine. It's really, really highly motivating for the rat. So people started to think, okay, maybe this is where intrinsic motivation is happening. The rat doesn't care about the bar or the button because of some external goal, like it's not a puzzle that I'm working through to like figure out what I want. It's just giving me the reward. It's just the bar is what I want. Pushing this button is my purpose in life. So the function of the nucleus accumbens is that it gives you this sense of reward and pleasure. That was first discovered from rats with little funny helmets on. It's clear from brain imaging studies now that this also is true of humans, that we see activity in the nucleus accumbens when you show somebody a pleasant image or a video of a kitten or whatever. You get a little bit of activity in the nucleus accumbens. A couple of things that are kind of interesting, maybe a little bit surprising about the nucleus accumbens. One is that you can actually get a stronger response by making the reinforcement less consistent, which is a little bit odd. You might think from an evolutionary standpoint, wouldn't it make more sense to invest in a reward that you're confident in, right? If the rat really knows that pushing the button is going to give you a reward, wouldn't that be the most motivating thing? And it turns out it's not. This is a kind of tragic fact about the mammalian brain, is that it's more reinforcing if you're not sure whether or not you're going to get a reward. So a great example of this is gambling. Another great example is social media. I mean, social media is designed to be intermittently reinforcing. You kind of, as you scroll, you kind of think, oh, that was cute. That's stupid. Ad. Oh, that's cute. Oh, that's stupid. It's just like gambling. And that turns out to be really, really strongly reinforcing. So it's kind of a sad thing. It would be nice if the human brain was the most reinforced for things that we know we're going to be rewarding, but that's just not how our motivation system works. So that's all nucleus accumbens. What I'm showing you here is a comparison between two brain structures. And I really like this study. This was done with music. So it's done in 3 phases. There's a baseline phase where you're not really doing anything. It's just kind of, you're just sitting in the chair. And then what they've done is the participants in this experiment have said, okay, this is my favorite song. This is the music. This is some moment that I really love. And you can give a timestamp to it. And if you think about it, you'll know exactly what this is for you. What is that moment in the concerto right before the key change, or the Jimi Hendrix, the pre-chorus right before the solo breaks out, or whatever. You know what that moment is for you. If you give somebody you put somebody in a scanner and you have them listen to this music, the nucleus accumbens will shoot up right when that rewarding thing happens, right when the solo starts or the thing that you love happens. The nucleus accumbens becomes very active. That's the sense of pleasure. But there's also a lot of dopamine activity in the seconds before that rewarding moment, and that's the anticipatory function of dopamine. That's happening in the striatum. I mentioned this part of the brain that is involved in riding a bicycle or doing a repeated action. It's that very same structure that when you're waiting for that moment, when you're waiting for that solo to start, your striatum is starting to wake up, starting to anticipate a reward. And what's really important about that is, again, the striatum is what chooses your motor activity. So that anticipation of a reward, that kind of, ooh, I think something good is about to happen, that is what causes the motor system to come online. Listening to music is a slightly artificial kind of reward because you don't really have to do anything in order to receive that reward. But most of the rewards that we get in ordinary life are things that we actually have to act for. You have to reach for the food. You have to go in for the hug. You have to do the thing that provides the dopamine. That requires some motor action on your part. And so it's the striatum that's kind of activating that, I anticipate that there's going to be a reward, and so I'm going to take the steps that are required for me to realize that reward. So the nucleus accumbens, we've started to talk about the striatum. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is most often associated with ADHD, in part because it's where a lot of the things seem to get stuck that people want, especially clinicians, parents, teachers, want this motivation. They want this goal-directed behavior. And the ability to kind of hold off on an immediate reward, like scrolling on social media, for a long-term reward, like studying or eating your vegetables. The prefrontal cortex is what kind of balances that out, or decides, okay, I'm going to put down my phone and go for this other thing that I know consciously is going to be more rewarding in the long run, even though it's not very rewarding in the short run. So the prefrontal cortex is involved in all of this like long-term thinking and planning activity. It's involved in ADHD, and I always want to pause over this because you will see constantly, you'll see images like this that suggest that there is less activity in ADHD in the prefrontal cortex. This is a study, it's worth getting into a little bit of the details here. So one thing that's interesting about this, this was done at MIT in 2014, and it was a little bit different from the normal way that this is studied. So often in a study like this, you'll take your clinical population, so folks with ADHD, and you'll take your control population, folks without ADHD, and you compare their brains. You can get a certain amount done that way. This is a little bit different. This is all the participants are people who were diagnosed with ADHD. And the control group is people who no longer present that way. So people who might have had the diagnosis when they were teenagers, who no longer have it because of treatment or because of whatever. And you see this very stark difference, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, a difference between people who are showing up as ADHD versus people who are showing up as more neurotypical. And it's a difference that shows up in the prefrontal cortex. So here's what's important about this. This does not mean that there's less activity in the prefrontal cortex. What you're showing here is the coordination of activity between prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain. So somebody who has ADHD does not have a silent or inactive prefrontal cortex. It's very likely to be constantly active. It's just constantly active off doing its own thing. And other parts of the brain are off doing their own thing. And so getting everybody on the same page to do what you need to do, to get out the door, to get in the car, to sit down and do your homework, takes a lot more effort than it does if the brain is just already coordinated. I think an important way to think about this is to think about like one reason why the ADHD participants in a study like this will often show up as having less coordinated activity in the prefrontal cortex is because we're distinguishing a task from a non-task image. During the task state, we should expect the prefrontal cortex to be very active. During the non-task default state, we should expect the prefrontal cortex to be kind of wandering, not doing too much. Turns out that's largely true for non-ADHD participants. For the ADHD participants, there's less difference between task and non-task. So I would think of it not so much as the prefrontal cortex is offline in some way. It's that the prefrontal cortex is always online, constantly online, and it's very difficult to distinguish between, okay, now is when I need focus, and now is when I need to do something, versus now is when I'm just in my default state and I don't need to be constantly sort of going off in the front of my brain. An important distinction here, with ADHD, what you're not necessarily seeing a reduction in planning activity or a reduction in motivation or a reduction even in executive function. What you're seeing is planning, motivation, executive function that are going off in their own direction rather than being kind of tied to the rest of the brain. Okay, very briefly, I want to explicitly tie this back to movement. We talked about autism, we talked about ADHD. There's another condition that very strongly involves dopamine, specifically the basal ganglia or the striatum, which is this very deeply buried structure. And that's Parkinson's disease. So a lot of the presentations with Parkinson's disease have parallels with the presentations in ADHD. And yet nobody ever says to somebody with Parkinson's disease, well, just try harder, or you're not applying yourself. Everybody kind of recognizes someone with Parkinson's disease has a neurological problem. But if you think about the kinds of presentations that you see in Parkinson's disease, I mean, we associate it with tremor, for example, which a tremor is basically an uninhibited or unsuppressed motor system. It's the motor, all of those other activities that normally are selected against in favor of the deliberate activity, they are coming through into the motor system because the striatum is unable to inhibit them, unable to make the decision. Similarly, with Parkinson's disease, you will see difficulty with initiating movement on just a physical level. So you'll have someone, for example, who can sit in a chair, and if they get a little bit of help, a little bit of a lift from the elbow, they can stand up on their own. The muscles are working okay. It's the initiation, the decision to stand up that is that's inhibited. So Parkinson's and ADHD are kind of have similar presentations. They have kind of similar treatments in that both of them are often treated with a kind of version of dopamine or a stand-in for dopamine. And yet, again, everybody kind of understands that Parkinson's disease is a motor issue, and we think of ADHD as a motivation issue. And that's not wrong, but it's missing the fact that those two really are the same thing. They're down to the same neural structure, the same neural circuitry underlying. So I'll just end with the same continuum that I started with. Neurologically, I can't and I don't want to are part of the same thing. And in order to understand why somebody might be lacking motivation or why they might be motivated in some contexts but not motivated in others, I think we really have to think of these as all part of the same system. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass it off to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Tavi, for that great explanation behind the scenes within the brain of um, how there is that continuum of and how dopamine is involved with motivation and the ability to achieve our goals and take action from a motor perspective. So we know that dopamine is involved in this process of moving our goals and our motivation to motor output, but it's really only a small part and one of the factors that's involved, right? There are so many other factors that are involved and that impact our brain, including this is not an exhaustive list, but it certainly gives us an understanding that taking action is a complex process, right? Nutrition, sleep, the time of day, any kind of history or trauma that we've experienced in our lives, our general preferences. Dr. Megan Neff has talked about our importance-driven nervous system versus our interest-driven nervous system versus a meaning-driven nervous system that we're going to hear about a little bit later. And then I love how Gustav has talked about our motor control is a factor that is involved in achieving our goals that in this neurodivergent space we don't talk about a lot of times. And then, of course, there are social skills, there's communication skills, there are academic skills, and they're all bundled up there in our brain. And I think that slide that you have about the need for all of the parts of our brain to be integrated when we are executing a task in the non-ADHD presentation is is represented in this slide in a completely different way, right? And a lot of the slides that I'm going to be sharing take what Gustav has just shared and put it into a different context for us to look at. So, as Gustav mentioned, it's really about our perspective, about how we see whether people are taking action or not, how we see people not taking action. Is it that they won't, they can't, or they did it, right? So our perspective matters because we can start with this idea that I want to, and that's a factor in and of itself. And we go through this roadmap of the brain that kind of is curvy, and this is a completely oversimplified. But we have the dopamine pathway goes through the brain in multiple different avenues. And if it's working together smoothly and effectively, we get to do what we want to do. Now, if a major motor area of the dopamine system is impacted, and it's a motor impact, we perceive, like Gustav said, that they can't, right? It's the primary motor cortex, it's the cerebellum, it's the premotor area that might be impacted in a stroke or in cerebral palsy and a brain injury. With dopamine, with Parkinson's, or there's another disease called Huntington's that also impacts the dopamine in different parts of the pathway, like Gustav said, they can't. And when any aspect of that dopamine system doesn't show up as a motor impairment, we perceive the inaction as they won't, and we get frustrated, right? But like he said, this shows that it's still that same dopamine pathway. We just have a different perspective on whether or not they are able to do it or they don't want to do it. And a lot of times what happens is our emotions, right? The things that we prefer to do or that are impacted a lot by that prefrontal cortex create these detours or these roadblocks that result in us doing other things because they impact the dopamine's processing and says, oh no, I'm going to go to something that I prefer to do. It impacts our attention. It impacts our activation and ability to follow through. And a lot of times that's why we get confused about why our kids are able to attend well to certain things and not attend well to other things. But the truth of the matter is that the underlying reason for the inaction is neurophysiologically based, and it's similar to Huntington's and Parkinson's. And our perspective matters because it's this neurophysiological basis that dopamine is impacting that's making it hard at the physiological level, the cellular level, for our kids to take action, to use that interest and motivation and carry it forward. So here's the breaking news of the evening, right? We can be motivated and unable to take action towards our goal. And it's brain-based. It's not behaviorally based. So if we want To perceive what we perceive to be a motivation problem is really difficulty with taking action. And so if we can we what we have to do, instead of saying, how come you won't do this, or you need to do this, or you should be doing this, we really have to see them as having a hard time. Because when someone looks like they can do something and they don't, we can't assume they aren't motivated. They can have the knowledge, they can have the skills, they can have the motivation, and they're having a hard time for some reason that's brain based and most likely due to the dopamine pathway getting started, planning it, or using their brain towards a goal directed behavior that we've been asking them to do or that they want and that they want to do. So we have to shift our perspective, because when we shift our perspective, it changes our response. When we go from they won't to they can't, it changes the way we communicate with someone. When we perceive someone as having Parkinson's, most often we shift into a role of how can I help? When we perceive someone as not wanting to do something, we have a tendency to use rewards and consequences or logic, telling them, oh, well, if you only do this, well, all you have to do is this. Or we explain to them what's going to happen if they don't. But what we have to do instead of being directive or being corrective is we shift it to they can't, and then we get curious. We become compassionate and we become collaborative. And when we can perceive things from a brain-based perspective, what we come to realize is that the inputs that our brain is bringing in works together. And I go back to that slide about the non-ADHD versus the ADHD presentation, and how the brain in the non-ADHD presentation is kind of fully integrating and all the parts are firing. And it creates an output that's different than if the inputs, right, that we are changing and supporting, giving to our kids. When we change our input, the inputs that they're receiving, they can change their outputs. So we have to change the inputs that we offer to meet the underlying needs of an individual. So some of those inputs could be the way that we communicate. Some of those inputs could be medication. Some of those inputs could be sensory. There are a variety of different inputs that can be changed to meet the underlying needs of an individual's brain. But the only way that we go about doing that is to become curious, to connect with our kids, and to become what I like to call partners in problem solving. And that's how we start to build a toolbox for our individual child that responds to their individualized brain-based needs along that dopamine pathway, or along the brain, whatever the pathway is for their brain that we're talking about that they have needs for, right? So when we can understand the underlying brain-based needs, we can use things like activators, things that get them going, that Teresa is also going to refer to as sparks. And we can use knowledge of things that derail me, that bring my attention away from the task I'm motivated to do, that I want to do, that I'm expected to do, and understand those blockers, as Teresa refers to them, to help me do what I need and want to do. And the important thing to remember is that this toolbox can be very individualized, right? And we, as the adult stakeholders in their life and as parents and caregivers, we're kind of that, if we go back to the analogy of it being a roadway, we're kind of the pit crew, right? Trying to discover what's at the root of the challenges so we can build that individual toolbox. So I'm going to pass it off to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Courtney. We are so excited to be here at Built Curious. Now let's see if I can share my screen with you. All right, let's try this. Are we good? Let's see. How are we doing? Okay. Good. Well, thank you so much, Riel, for having us. Thank you to Yael and Callie and Teresa and just everybody at Riel. It's been so warm and wonderful and welcoming, and it's been such a pleasure even just preparing for this talk with the team because there's such nice feelings. And it's also so heartening to see so many parents and familiar faces. I see friendly faces in the crowd, listening, and everybody's here to support their kids and to learn something new that will help. We're speaking about motivation today, and today we're going to learn to think like anthropologists. Now, I studied. My name's Elizabeth. Cobb. I'm a neurodivergent parent of two neurodivergent children, and I studied cultural anthropology at Princeton. And I return to anthropology in my life anytime I need to understand something. So I went to UC Berkeley to Gustav's class, Diversities of the Human Brain. And I took that last year, and it was so helpful to me in my work with my kids that I asked Dr. Steinhardt if he would talk to parents about this information, and he said yes. We have been working with parents in small groups. We've been speaking at conferences. We were speaking at the Nueva Innovative Learning Conference recently. And what has been so wonderful to see is how just having the neuroscience information available really can transform parents' understanding of their kids. So today we're going to do a little bit of that, and both Gustav and Courtney have teed that up beautifully. So we're going to think like anthropologists. We're going to learn neuroanthropology concepts that reframe behaviors. We've already sort of started to do that. And so now we're going to apply this biocultural framework to our everyday experiences. And we'll learn to evaluate information about neurodiversity using a critical lens. And a good example of this would be one of Gustav's colleagues at Berkeley, Laura Sterponi, who does a great deal of work as a linguistic anthropologist with neurodiversity and specifically autistic children in analyzing conversations between parents and children to understand the communicative intent in children and to show how the relationship between parents and children is where the meaning is created. With the biocultural framework that we've developed at Built Curious, we recognize that our understanding of neurodiversity has to consider both the biological and cultural factors. Neurodivergence is not an individual trait, it's a mismatch between a person and their environment. But the biological is something we always have to hold in our minds because changes to society or changes to a person's environment, that doesn't change everything. If you've got a kid who gets dysregulated on windy days, that's not going to change by changing the environment. I guess you could move to a place that's not so windy, but we need to hold both. And so, how is this approach different? These are not how-tos to change behavior. This is how to think differently about behavior. This is not deficit or strengths based. It's how to think about difference. And I think it's important to mention that because a lot of times I think strengths-based approaches get misunderstood and used as sort of a superpower narrative. And it's important to remember that Everyone deserves respect and understanding, regardless of whether or not they have superpowers. Um, so to build on Courtney's point, her excellent point about motivation versus activation, um, when shame enters the picture, it can make it hard to see that all behavior is communication. And once shame isn't in the driver's seat, then we can ask, okay, what does my child need? And that question alone often can transform motivation into activation. So, how can we operationalize what we just learned? So, you see an example here. I love this slide. In fact, I was just explaining this slide, Courtney, to a parent recently in our course and said, I often think of this when I'm getting the kids ready for school in the morning and you're trying to get from your child's bedroom to the front door, and it feels like a Formula One race. And um, having all of these dopamine circuits working in concert together can feel as challenging as a Formula One race. And we can be the activation pit crew. And I think this coordination that you heard both Gustav and Courtney talking about is really, really important. We can be the ones to coordinate their needs. So you can think of interest as the fuel and autonomy as the engine and sensory processing as where the rubber meets the road. The you see the pit crew here changing the tires. And when we are trying to understand what our children need, sometimes all three of those can be at play. If a child is not wanting to brush their teeth on the way out of the door in the morning, it could be a lack of interest. It could be a lack of autonomy. It could be that the brush doesn't feel good or the water's too loud. Sometimes it's all of the above. And we are the pit crew who gets to decide, okay, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to my driver and hear the child and really try to understand what's going on for them. And it's hard to do because, as you saw, there are pit crews 50 strong, and we're only one or two people getting our kids out the door in the morning. So, one area where all three of these um, aspects of motivation or activation, rather, come into play is in the pervasive drive for autonomy. You may have heard of it as pathological demand avoidance. That's what it used to be called. If you haven't heard of it, what it is when a child has a very difficult time with any request that is perceived as a demand. So even preferred activities, a kid loves going to chess club every day, but refuses to go because simply being asked to go is perceived as a demand. So PDA, pervasive drive for autonomy, is a response to perceived demands. It's not defiance, it's not manipulation. And, for that reason, a lot of the accommodations that we can provide for our kids can be challenging for us to identify. But we really want to rethink. We don't want to just, change the words in the acronym. We want to actually rethink what PDA is. And we can do that using Gustav's movement and motivation slide. So if we start to think of motivation as a continuum, and if we start to understand how something that looks like I don't want to is a little closer to I can't, then we can understand what's going on in PDA. And an example of that is PDA equalizing. So equalizing or leveling is a power dynamic to regain control or autonomy. It's both a nervous system response, so it's automatic, and a social strategy. And I think that's where it gets confusing for us as parents because we sometimes have trouble telling why a certain thing is happening. And let me give an example. a child might say when you ask them to take their dishes to the kitchen, no, and then they'll do it 10 minutes later. That is very often a result of PDA equalizing or leveling. There's a need to have control and to exert some sort of power that regains autonomy. And then the task can be done. Or if a child says, well, I'll only do it if you do this for me, or I'll only do X if I'm allowed to do Y, where Y is maybe watch a show. Um, if we start to understand these, what we think of as negotiation tactics as uh, a form of balancing, then we can start to work with what our kids are saying and really understand a bit better. Um, there's a lovely quote, and it's a mouthful, but I think it's worth going over by a woman, an Australian woman called Christy Forbes, and she is a PDAer herself, and she has PDA children. And she says, I encourage us all to consider the behaviors we're told are unacceptable or confrontational or even abusive in our children as forms of balancing in a person who requires equity outside of socio-political hierarchies. Now, that last part is quite a mouthful, so let's unpack it. We see our kids, we might see them hit when confronted with a request or a demand. We might not perceive it as a demand. Sometimes even the wording makes a difference. If I say, let's all go out for pizza, no way. But if I say, could we go out for pizza? That is often perceived really differently by a PDAer. And it's important to remember that in the parent-child relationship, which is inherently unequal, it's a very unequal power dynamic. Our kids, with their neurospicy sense of justice, very often will bristle at that inequality. I have an example of that. My oldest, this was a conversation from several years ago when the Queen was still with us, the Queen Elizabeth. I said to her at the dinner table, because she does not use silverware, she prefers to eat with her hands, and she's allowed to at home because I know research that shows that the tactile input from feeding with hands does aid in digestion. So, but there are times when silverware is required. And I said to her, well, what would you do if you were invited to lunch with the Queen? And she said, oh, I wouldn't mind. I'd just tell her I'm here for the corgis. So she told me very clearly in no uncertain terms, it didn't matter if you were the Queen of England, that she considered herself on the same level in terms of the amount of respect and justice that she deserved in terms of her preferences. In this case, her preference not to use silverware. And I think keeping this in mind really helps me because it equalizing in times when it's not a clever quip or something that is easy to make light of, when it's something a little more serious. So I just want to leave you with the thought that we are the pit crew, and it just like it's the pit crew's job to decide what needs to attention when, we can also perceive that similar behaviors might have different causes depending on the kid or the day. So is procrastination a PDA equalizing challenge? Is it an ADHD multi-step instruction? issue? Is it a task initiation issue? Is it both? Is it neither? And when we only study symptoms like anxiety, we miss opportunities for understanding. So, thank you so much for having us. And I'm going to turn it over to Teresa to tell us about the sparks and the blockers and how we can make this work for our kids.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm really excited to take this on now. Let me know if you can see my slides. Yes, excellent. Okay. So my name is Teresa Nair, and I am the Real Parent Community Service Program Manager. What that means, though, is ultimately that I get to work with amazing colleagues like the three that you guys have heard from tonight. And then I get to learn and work with parents too, and kind of take the information and all of this great stuff that Elizabeth, Tavi, and Courtney have brought to us and kind of tell you what we do with it in our community and how we use it as parents. And a lot of it is strategy and curiosity and learning from each other. So like Elizabeth said, let's kind of start tonight with what does my child need? So instead of the idea of relying on willpower or pressure for this quote unquote motivation idea, we're going to take this opportunity to learn what actually helps the neurodivergent brain. We need we need them to like begin this whole scenario, but then we also need them to continue and reset. Because if your neurodivergent kiddo is anything like mine or anything like myself, it's not a one and done. I don't know. Are there actually people that start something and finish it like all in one go without, procrastination and blocking and all those things? So that kind of brought us to looking at motivation as this cycle, really, because oftentimes when we're working with this neurodivergent brain, we're coming across the idea where we need to activate the brain, we need to spark it, we need to get it going. And then oftentimes, because of so many different things, the world is not designed for neurodivergent brains. It could be lights, it could be sounds, it could be smells, it could be executive function overwhelm. There's so many reasons why blockers would then begin to come in. So looking kind of at this motivation as a cycle is where we've kind of taken this in our small group discussions with parents and thought about, okay, when we have all the knowledge and understanding, there's so much going on back there, but how do we apply it? So I get to tell some stories tonight and tell you what we kind of did in our small groups. So we talked about two different systems. So you've probably heard, and we've referred to that idea of this interest-based ADHD system, right? This is where things are often sparked and fueled by novelty, curiosity, play, those unique things that ADHD brain craves and is driven by, right? That sparks that gets us going. It's kind of that dopamine-driven activation system. And then I kind of looked at that and I said, I think autism runs a little bit differently, right? But these are just places to start. So for autism, I look at that and I say they're kind of fueled by this clarity and a fairness and a predictability and deep interest. And I laugh about this because, if I was to say to my autistic child something that was extremely unfair, like, and they look at me and say, that's so unfair. Like motivation to do whatever we were supposed to get done stopped, like blocker in the way. This is not even fair. So kind of understanding that sometimes, or predictability, or all of these other things, sometimes just by understanding our neurology, the way our brains are, wired in some cases, it can begin to start these conversations. Is it the answer for everything? No. Is everybody different? For sure. But, you might have that instance where the teacher told, my son to do X, Y, and R. And he's like, why R? Like, R makes absolutely no sense right there. So I couldn't do it. Like right there, block came in before we even began because He craves that need for logic, predictability, clarity. So as we kind of look at this, I want to think about motivation, not as this trait, but as a system. And we're going to get curious how our kids' systems work. That's where this, curiosity comes from. And we can kind of take these steps. So um, we can look at this and list a whole bunch of sparks. I encourage that you do this with your kids. It's it's something that you might start off with for yourself. I put examples on the left because we might want to, just sit down by ourselves and notice that, okay, my kiddo really does need autonomy. How can I build in our motivation cycle, whether it's the motivation cycle to get out the door in the morning, whether it's the motivation cycle to get the shower done in the evening, whether it's the motivation cycle to try and get homework done. How can I bring some autonomy to that? Because I know that that kind of gets them interested in what's going on a little bit more, or might get them engaged a little bit more. It might spark them. How can I build in something along the lines of a spark of playlists? My family loves playlists. They spark so many different things. Like my daughter's Hamilton playlist for cleaning, spark right there. Put on Hamilton and like they are excited to clean and sing at the top of their lungs. Um, I have a playlist for showers. It's my spark. Just putting that on can help me engage a little bit more. So working with your kids and starting to think about sparks and blockers might be fun. And listen, because I have a feeling that some of the sparks that they're going to tell you, like what gets you going, you might not even have thought of. They're going to come up with something crazy like, um, we'll talk about some more stories about that. But so sensory is another good one. Think about that as a spark. How can I build in sensory? In one of our small groups, I had a parent who said their kiddo only liked showers if they could use all the soap, like all the shampoo soap. And mom's like, we can't do that. Like that, I understand it's a sensory thing, and that gets him activated and interested and motivated to do the shower. But we are literally washing down an entire bottle of soap and money down the drain every single time. So, as a small group, as parents, we were able to sit down and strategize. Okay, what if you get those little travel sizes? And he knows that he gets to choose, because autonomy is a great thing, before the shower starts. He has a spark of a choice of which little shower bottle he wants to take, and each one has a different little soap and, sensory activity into it. So kind of building these in when you know you have a challenge of whatever it might be. The same thing with blockers, right? What are the blockers? This can be something like executive function overwhelm. We talk about this a lot, and we talked about the prefrontal cortex a lot tonight. This is when, air traffic control of the brain skipped and then everything blocked up and everything stopped. So how can we put these things into place and take out the blockers before they even happen? So if we know that transitions are a blocker or unpredictability is a blocker, let's write that down because we can get curious, but we can also forget. And, it might be a list that you're going to refer to one night because you're like, oh my gosh, I cannot figure out how to get my child, to X, Y, and Z. And you'll be like, oh, that's right. We did that silly little thing where we listed sparks and blockers. And you might just look at that and be like, oh, that's right. At the end of the day, no snack, blocker. Got to feed the kid. So, all these little things are going to be hints because we're not always going to remember it. We're not always going to have it there with us. So, one of the things I like to say is the storytelling kind of behind what we do. I had a um, I had another amazing colleague that I was working with. He joined us the other night for one of our small groups, and I had a parent who said, "My kid is not motivated. He doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to do his homework. He's failing his classes. It's like he doesn't care about anything. How do I get him to care? How do I get him motivated?" Um, and it was really interesting because Dr. Mason said at that point in time, I want you to know that your child obviously cares. He cares very deeply. Because if you think about somebody who doesn't care about what's going on, it looks very different. You've got that, footloose, fancy free, I don't care attitude. Our kids oftentimes, when they're withdrawn, angry, having a really difficult time, it's because they deeply care and they're probably in this cycle of being activated to do something, being let down by their executive functions and failing, and then having to try to get back up again. And they go through this cycle and it's failed them repeatedly. So unfortunately, that's just the way life is, but we can get in there and start to curate in a neural affirming way. So how do we get in there and say, I see that you're struggling, and it's not because you don't care. It's because somehow, somewhere in this system, in this cycle, you're getting tripped up. You're running into a blocker. And that's what this language hopefully can be, even for the young kids and for the older kids. I have my, 16 and 14-year-old who will talk about they need a spark. Getting homework started. You need a spark? Yeah. Okay. What kind of spark do you think you might need? Popcorn. All right, let's go with the popcorn. So even if it's just a way to begin the dialogue of, I see you and I want to be a part of this. How can I support you? Sparks and blockers. Another thing we love about our groups is scripts, because we weren't necessarily taught how to have, positive conversations that aren't judgy, that aren't, condemning. Unfortunately, that was a language that we were taught, instead of stop wasting time. How about we try something along the lines of, do you need a different way in? Do you need a reset? How can I help here? Sometimes the brain needs a spark to get moving. What could your spark be? Is there something that I can help provide? And this idea of, it's not something that you've done wrong. It's something that we can solve by taking a different action. And so I love these scripts. We do them all the time. Like I said, one of them is like my daughter answering, I need popcorn. I'm like, oh, okay, who knew spark was popcorn? Or another one being a blocker. We had a family who their teenage son would not clean the bathroom. Mom is like, I have put everything, like all the cleaning supplies on the floor of his bathroom for weeks. He just walks past them. And I got curious because I noticed that he was angry about it. Like when it would be talked about, he was angry. So it wasn't that he didn't care. There was something more going on here. So I literally was like, hey, bud, what's going on? Is there something blocking you about this bathroom cleaning thing? And he literally said the words, I don't even know what to do with all those things. And I was like, boom, we've got a dialogue here. We've got something we can work with. The blocker is executive function, task initiation, working memory. I can help us walk through this now, just from that outburst of, I don't even know what to do with all these things. All right, here we go. Let's solve it. So coming at it with that curiosity. Here's another one. Just get started. Kind of the same thing. This kid was, mom was like, just get started. Why can't you? He didn't really have the words, but us as adults can begin to listen for those keys and get to know a little bit more. So one thing, like non-preferred tasks. I hate studying for spelling. Okay, this is a good one. We've got lots of families who are like, we have to review spelling every week and those kind of things. Okay, what does your kid enjoy doing? I don't know. One of their sparks is like they love slime. Could they play with slime while you guys are reviewing spelling words? I mean, simple things like that, like involving the body and the brain and the sensory all in one, to really expand and explore what it means to be activated. And we had all the wonderful science behind it. So thank you to the wonderful team for those kind of things. Let's see, is there anything else? So I like Dr. Megan and Enough did a wonderful talk about motivation with real back couple months ago, and she said, I want to take the stigma away from extrinsic motivation. I think oftentimes we put that, kind of dive deep. Your kids should have intrinsic motivations. She's like, how often do we actually, though, as adults, when we're having a tough time, say, oh, wait, I have to go to work because I need a paycheck? Extrinsic, right? So when our kids need something to help them get a little motivated, whether it's popcorn or some slime to play with while they do their spelling words or review for science, let it be. I had one of my kiddos was talking about having to listen to Death of a Salesman, and they were just like, "Oh, this is gonna kill me." But then they were like, "But then I did Legos the whole time." So they like listened to Death of a Salesman and did Legos and had a great time. They got it done. They got through it, and um, I hope that we can find this joy and this idea of sometimes extrinsic motivation is helpful, and we don't want to shame it anymore. Um, let's see, what's another fun thing that we can move into? The rest of the cycle. So we've talked about in great detail this wonderful idea of sparks and blockers. Blockers come from left and right. In the middle of things, you've got the flow going on, and all of a sudden somebody calls, or your mom says it's dinner time, and you're yanked out of the flow. Blocker shows up. You have to spark again. But the other things I want to remind our community about is recovery and feedback. Because without these two pieces, we really don't get a chance to understand what motivates our children, what gets them through this cycle. So what does recovery and feedback look like? It's important. It's important for us as neurodivergent individuals. It's important for our kiddos. They are literally, um, using so much brain power, and they're physically so active. We need to make space and time for their nervous system and their bodies to recover, because if they don't have the recovery time, how do you get motivated? Have you ever been completely exhausted and been like, yeah, I'm not motivated to do anything? Our kids do that almost every single day. They've got 8 hours and then they come home and they continue to work for another three. Like, let's work in some recovery here. We had one parent mention, I really want to help my kid, but they hate doing homework. They want to take all these advanced classes, but how do I, get them motivated to do homework at the end of the day when they're exhausted? My suggestion is great job, excellent job. Listen, the kid is exhausted at the end of the day. They want these advanced classes. Can they drop an elective and put in a study hall instead? How do we help them take out what we know as the blocker, the exhaustion at the end of the day, by a spark of, in the middle of the day, you will have this time to dedicate. Are you going to have to get something up? Yep. Sometimes that's life, right? You got to go through the lessons. So as we're working to help our kids balance their nervous system, finding whether it's active or passive movement that works for them, humor, play, that ADHD recharged by being around friends and playing basketball, or that quiet, passive, reading a book under a weighted blanket, include that in the system. Without it, we're going to not get very far with our motivation. And the feedback loop. I noticed in the comments some people talking about, like, how do I get my kids and how do we remember like what these sparks are, what these activations are? Verbalize it, put it in calendars, and listen without reacting. Listen to understand, not to react. That was a great quote. I can't remember exactly who said that. But so when we're talking about this, make it a casual talk. Maybe it's a daily, maybe it's a weekly thing, but make it a habit to look back on when things went really well. What was going on then? Like, that went pretty smooth tonight. Like, bedtime routine went pretty smooth tonight. What do you think helped? And make it a habit to verbalize it or even put it in the calendar. So another one is, last week things seemed pretty challenging. Why do you think that might have been? Like, I wonder what was going on. Swim lessons. I had one family talk about swim lessons. I couldn't get my kid motivated to go to swim lessons. I'm like, all right, talk to him about it. What's going on? Well, just so you know, you're probably going to get a rant. You're probably going to get an earful. And they did. I was tired. It was at the end of the day. I didn't have any snacks. It was so loud in there and I was cold and everybody just kept yelling. And like, whoa, okay, don't react. This is all data. And then take a moment to, talk to your kid about it in the car and be like, all right, okay, so let's put in the calendar next week to remember, to bring a snack. Oh, and your comfy sweatsuit, because if you're cold, let's do a sweatsuit. And you might not get it all right the first time, but you've taken that opportunity to help them realize they have the power to change what's going forward. They have the power to be a part of this cycle, and they need to take the data set in themselves too. So whether it is this casual car ride, making notes in your calendar for the next time so that when it does go smooth, you've got notes there that say, oh yeah, it was, worked well to bring XYZ. It worked well to do these things. Because ultimately our goal is that our kids will be able to understand and enjoy and figure out how their system works for them. And that's what we have tonight for this exciting topic of motivation. Yael, what do you have for us?
Thank you so much. If you don't mind stopping sharing, we can ping you guys so that spotlight you guys. Callie, if you have spotlighting ability, you can spotlight too. Is this not working? There we go. Got two of you. Thank you, Callie. Okay, so we have some questions now. One of these questions was asked while Gustav was speaking. And so I think Teresa covered it a little bit at the end, but I'm going to ask you, with ADHD, I've noticed the dopamine will hit, but they will have forgotten about it the next time the same event happens. How can we help this process of not remembering? I did it like this. It wasn't so bad. I can do this. Often people say, oh, they'll learn if they just keep doing it, but that's not my experience.
Yeah, there's a name for this. It's called dopamine transfer. Dopamine transfer is the movement of the dopamine response into that anticipatory phase after you've repeated it a few times. So typically, for a neurotypical person, if I go through a few trials of a thing and I find that I get dopamine from it, the dopamine is going to shift from that nucleus accumbens, from that reactive dopamine, into the striatum. It's going to move into anticipating and taking steps to achieve that reward. One of the things that shows up with ADHD is that that transfer doesn't happen. And so exactly what you're describing, you sort of think, haven't you learned from experience that this is okay? And the answer is just no. The dopamine system isn't doing that. And so I think we have a lot of systems and habits that are based on the assumption that people's brains are going to sort of logically maximize their return on investment, and that barely works even for neurotypical people, and really doesn't work at all for ADHDers. So, I mean, I think the answer, and I think this will end up being the answer for a lot of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat is, I mean, there isn't an easy solution. There isn't, we can't say for every child that this is going to be, or every learner or whatever, that this is going to be the solution. Anybody who tells you they've got a brain-based solution that works for everyone is selling you something. The whole point is that everybody's brain is different, right? So I really like what Courtney and Teresa and Elizabeth have been saying about getting collaborative, because we don't have expertise on what's going to work for your particular situation, but you have somebody in your household who does have that expertise, and relying on that person to articulate what they need, and recruiting them as an ally is so important. But yeah, I think the the dopamine transfer issue is very real, and what it means, I think, is that the same sparks and blockers conversation that happens the first time probably happens the 30th time. That's just what's going to happen.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to wait. Go ahead.
Well, and I would also, and like a lot of times we as parents want to help our kids remember what they're not remembering. Don't you remember this happened? Instead of getting curious or reflective with them, right? So, what happened the last, do you remember what happened the last time we did this? Okay, so if they can tap into that memory, okay, so walk me through what we did, right? And so we're helping them tap into what happened to see what they remember of their experience along the way. So instead of telling them what they experienced, we help them tap into their memory to see what they remember, which can then inform where they are, what their thought process is. And if they don't remember that it was a positive outcome, well, then we know they're not remembering it's a positive outcome. And it was, or it took an exponential amount of energy from them to get started. And that's the piece where they're remembering. So that's the blocker. And so we have to figure out, okay, so when you feel that way or when that happens to you, where's your spark? What's the spark? How can we bring a spark into this situation? And I think a lot of our language is what I saw someone say, how do we get rid of the shame, right? Like it's a lot of the language that people are using around our kids saying you should or this. If we can remove that and use this curiosity with the sparks and the blockers and help them understand their motivation cycle instead of telling them how to do their motivation cycle, that is going to help melt away that protective layer of shame that has built up over the years.
Thank you. Anybody else or next question? Okay. A lot of teachers ask this question: how can I tell the difference between a student who is lacking motivation due to a lagging skill or neurodivergence versus a student that just doesn't want to do the work? Primarily, this is asked so they can respond in a way that will support the student with the work.
I mean, my answer to that is if you give them an incentive and they immediately change, or you give them a consequence and they immediately change, their brain works with rewards and consequences, right? So you can like, okay, well, and I would never like if you don't do it now, you're gonna have to do it at home. And a lot of kids are not gonna want to have to do it at home, right? So they'll be able to say, "Oh, I don't want to do this at home." They'll be able to use that logic and get started. If you mention that to them and they don't get started, there's probably something else that's blocking them, right? So if traditional approaches don't work, they probably won't ever work, and we have to use a different approach. And the sooner we can use a different approach, the less shame, guilt, and negative self-narrative we will have kids developing.
Yeah, I think all of us here probably lean into the Dr. Ross Greene, kids do well when they can. And I hope, that the teachers can take that idea and know that this kid does not want to be the failure of the class. And if they've taken that label on, it's because it's been a part of their cycle and that's where they feel comfortable staying because that's what's expected. But underneath, I would say most kids want to succeed. So how can we help them do that? Um, I think that's where we can look at that neurodivergence. Like, is there a processing issue? Is there an IEP that can give us some insights here? If there is, then it's like, okay, working memory is an issue here. This kid doesn't want to get started because I need to do X, Y, and Z to help them through this block of literal skills, neurodivergence, all of these things can be the blocks. So how, as a teacher, can we find those clues? The IEP, past behavior, what does work? All of those things will give us clues. But As a teacher, former teacher, I can tell you it's a lot on your table, on your plate, taken for each kid, but it's important and it's valuable.
Thank you guys. Okay. Couple people put thumbs up on this one. Sometimes I feel motivation is there, but partway through, it's no longer there. But if I take a break, it's hard to come back to it, the distractibility of it all. I'm not sure what to do there.
I
Anyone?
mean, I'm happy to field this, but I don't want to monopolize the initial that answers. But again, my thinking is if you know you're going to be taking a break and you know you have a hard time coming back to it, what is some type of I call it um, kind of a boundary that or some type, it's not quite a spark and it's not quite a blocker, right? But it might be an anti-block, it might be a blocker, right? But I call it a boundary because um, we know that we're going to have a hard time. So what can we do in anticipation of that blocker to help spark us back to what we wanted to do? Right. So it might be a combination of a boundary, like maybe there's an alarm to be set, or maybe we call a friend and say, "Hey, can you call me in 5 minutes? Because I'm taking a break. I need to take a break, and can you just make sure I'm back on track?" And then you add in a spark, like you do um, jumping jacks if movement is a spark for you, or you put on a different playlist to help activate a different part of your brain to spark you into doing um, what you need to return to. So like boundary, spark, and figure out what are your phone of friends that are boundaries for you to help so that you don't get lost into the break.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to echo the point about community and having other people involved. I see this, I work with neurodivergent college students all the time, and I see the value of community, and especially neurodivergent community, if you can get it, if you can get some ADHDers together to kind of like compare notes, that's super, super helpful. I know it's not always possible, but both for accountability and also just for the sort of the validating sense of like, oh, there's other people out here that also work this way. So yeah, it can sound like kind of a hokey answer, but I think community solves a lot of these problems, or at least gives you the platform from which to solve the problems.
Great point. Um, okay. So we talked about this a little bit, but how do we get shame out of the driver's seat? Shame, rejection, or fear of failure is usually at the forefront of inhibiting action.
So I wanted to mention the giftedness trap. I think it's either Dr. Megan Anna Neff or there's also Jamie Roberts and Rainstone. Those were two really good talks about kind of this idea of giftedness and all that that brings as far as identity. And then when you're twice exceptional, there's a but. Like they're so smart, but, and so kind of this trap of what happens when, you have this identity, and then when your struggles take place, that shame that just kind of piles on you because you can no longer be that smart kid. And it's no fault of your own. It truly is just kind of like they talk about this giftedness trap of and how we as parents and educators can be aware of like how we talk about giftedness and how we talk about effort and creativity and all of those things without setting up a trap of when things get hard, they don't know how to identify themselves. They don't know who they are. They used to get all good grades and straight A's, and all of a sudden, the shame of not being able to do it is a spiral. So I highly recommend. I don't know if Kelly can drop some of those links, but it's really a big topic that is worth talking about.
And I think that language goes back to the Greene language, right? It looks like you're having a hard time. And it goes back to our perspective in how we communicate. So I see you're having a hard time rather than the perspective of you're giving me a hard time, right? And so if they really want to do well, they're striving for autonomy. They have had this strong sense of agency and independence and ability for so long. They hit a wall, and we have to be there to hold them, right? And put the pieces back together so that they're not creating this narrative about self that I'm a failure, right? It's we've hit a wall, we sort of normalize that people hit walls. And I always find it important to use the word as a connector of and, because both things that we're talking about can be true instead of the word but. And a lot of times that word but invalidates everything we say in affirming our kid in the first half of the sentence. And if we can connect it with the word and, it can be you're having a hard time and we can figure this out. Or you're having a hard time, but I know you can do it. The but invalidates the first part for the what the person hears. So it's so important for us to use that word um, and we can figure this out together. And I know and through figuring out together, we model for our kids, which is going to be so important for them going forward, that using help is kind of something that everybody does. So we normalize being able to ask for help, being able to use for help, and we model how to do that because it's something that's new for them at a variety, some of them don't learn it until they're in adulthood, and that can be a really hard crash.
Thank you, guys. There's a question about how does ADHD medication, what does it do to the brain things we talked about? Like, does it help with dopamine transfer between the various parts of the brain?
So yeah, I mean, depending on the medication in particular that we're talking about, yes, one of the things that it can do is either elevate or stabilize just the total amount of dopamine or the activity of dopamine, which if what you're dealing with is either a dopamine system that's quieter or a dopamine system that is intermittently quieter and louder. Either of those might present with somebody who has trouble getting things started, has trouble with dopamine transfer. And so, yes, ADHD meds absolutely will help people with those kinds of executive function things. That again, I think is really difficult to say in the abstract whether this would work for one person's particular circumstance, because who knows? And as with all psychoactive drugs, everybody's brain is different and everybody's going to respond differently. And very often we don't really know the mechanism by which these things work. We know that Adderall, for example, is elevating the dopamine response in the brain, but exactly where that's happening is going to vary from brain to brain. So I'm a big time advocate of being open to medication. I don't think it's the right solution for everybody, but it absolutely helps the people that it helps.
We have a question from a student, so I'd like to prioritize that. She says, as a neurodivergent student, what is the best way to identify a blocker, find a way to push through at the spark, and make sure that these helpful habits stay as consistent as possible so that I continue having my spark and that I don't go back to dealing with the blocker burning out and repeating the harmful cycle? What a great question.
So, just off the top of my head, I would say have a list of sparks, because one might work and it might not be exactly what you need at another time. The blockers are the ones we want to mitigate, right? If we can take that out of the picture even before the situation, that's what we hope. So if being interrupted is something that is a challenge for you, and that that's a blocker and it's going to jerk you out of your flow, try and figure out how you can make sure that that doesn't happen. Get to a place where you can mitigate that blocker. So even knowing your blockers beforehand and trying to make sure that they're not around or a part of your experience is one way to go about it. There's a lot of ways, but it's truly kind of having a couple go-tos and then knowing what's going to make you stall. And then when you have to get back up again, give yourself that grace. I didn't talk about the spoon theory, but in case you haven't gotten a chance to look at the spoon theory, give yourself grace, and the spoon theory can help with that too. Sometimes you're just going to run out of spoons, and no matter what spark or blocker you run into, it's over for the day. I have no more spoons. I have nothing else to give. So it's time to go into recovery, and reset yourself. So
Yeah.
hopefully that's a little helpful.
I think that's spot on, Teresa, and also the sometimes the language about pushing through can be really helpful. Sometimes it's really motivating to think, yes, I'm gonna flex my muscles and I'm gonna push through this obstacle and I'm gonna feel really accomplished. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes the pushing through isn't really the way to frame it. Sometimes the way to frame it is I'm gonna flow around this obstacle, right? Or I'm gonna percolate through the gaps in this obstacle, but somehow thinking of it as moving downhill in a way. If it's for example if it's schoolwork, if it's a reading that you just think I really don't want to do this, but I'm just going to push through. I'm just going to grit my teeth and I'm just going to push through. That might not work. And in that same situation, reframing it as I'm going to allow myself the privilege of reading this thing that I'm actually kind of excited about, right? If you can reframe it that way, that also is not always going to work. But if you're in one of those moments where the push through doesn't work, allow yourself through might work better.
I'm also a big fan of thinking about it as, okay, like when we can allow ourselves to feel the block and have that emotion and say, oh, this really stinks. I am stuck right now. And we can name it. That sometimes like allows us to feel like emotions. Javi, maybe you can help me with this, Elizabeth. Emotions have a physiological lifespan of like 30 seconds, right? But if we keep giving it energy, it will keep building in our brain and having energy in our brain and in our body. If we name it and we can release it and kind of to like change scenery or something, or again, reach out to a friend and say, I'm really having a hard time. Like, do you have any ideas on what I might be able to do? And being vulnerable and saying I need help can sometimes also help us get around that, work with that flow state as well. Um, and then I think developing awareness around what environments help you activate or give you sparks, what time of day gives you sparks, and thinking about how you can set up, if you have that flexibility, how you can set yourself up to do the hardest things at a time when you have the most success in the day or in the type of environment that you have. And it's really an experimental mindset, like Teresa was talking about, trying to figure out how do I set myself up for success with the most um, opportunity for success, and then give myself grace to recover if I hit a block, and then learn from that cycle and iterate on that cycle so that you build an understanding of who you are and what your brain needs and when and where and how you can have success more frequently.
I love that. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It is 8:35. We're supposed to end 5 minutes ago. There are three more questions if people want to stay. I don't know if speakers are available to stay for maybe 5 more minutes. But anyone that needs to go, we have put the feedback link in the chat. We'd love your feedback on this event. Thank you so much. There's so many great questions. What if a kid asks for sparks that are distracting? My kid wants me to read aloud while she does her math homework, which feels counterproductive.
Um, Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to say try it.
I was
What
just
the
gonna say
hell?
the same
What the
thing. I was
hell?
like,
My
are they
Give it the
my
really
question is,
experience.
it feels
counterproductive?
counterproductive to
That's, yeah,
whom, right?
that's what I
So,
said too. So yes.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I do think there are, in theory, there might be sparks that really genuinely are destructive, right? Or, I mean, the example of the using all the soap in the shower, right, is a great example of, sometimes the sparks are just not workable. But even just asking the question starts you getting into, okay, for this particular person, the thing that is activating that anticipatory dopamine spike is the sensory experience of this. So let's work with that. That's our first insight, and that's where we're going to put the shovel in and kind of start digging until we find something that does work. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we should sit up here and say that, just do whatever the spark is, because sometimes that's not going to be feasible. But I do think whatever the spark is informative at the very least.
Right. And so it might be, not you reading aloud as much as maybe they just need an auditory
Mhm.
something in the background. Like Bach for me was great when I was studying. When I was doing animation, I would put on like, rave music. So it might just be that they need some auditory stimulation. So maybe you could try a music instead, or something along the lines, like, Tavi's saying, let's explore what does that maybe mean in other ways.
I think that's why some people have to think about their environment. Are they in a quiet library? Or are they in a coffee shop? Are they in like the louder part of the library, right? Or are they um, in at home having the TV on? They call it a counter stimulus when sometimes people need something in the background auditorily. It's called a counter stimulus that they need to be able to focus and attend.
It's so great that the kid came up with that too. Um, I've understood PDA as being more related to anxiety. How does anxiety fit into PDA and to motivation in general?
It's funny because we talked about this at last year's Stanford conference, and there wasn't a clear there wasn't a clear consensus, but I'm going to try and reframe that discussion as best I can. Um, PDA is, anxiety is a symptom of PDA, and it's like an indicator of something that we need to pay attention to. And just as we were talking about, if we study symptoms, that really only gets us so far. And I think what looking at PDA just as its own entity does for us is it helps us tune into those moments of communication. Whereas when we have such a big lens like anxiety that's so amorphous, it doesn't actually give us that much information to look at. Whereas drilling down into PDA really kind of helps us, okay, let's identify places where we're having equalizing happening, or what is the underlying need? Is it a sensory need? Is it a need for autonomy? Um, does that answer the question, or is there more?
And I don't know if Tavi, you might have something to add to this, but the way I perceive it is anxiety is our brain trying to protect us, right? From something, whether it's real or perceived, right? But the anxiety is trying to protect us, so it activates our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic portion of our autonomic nervous system. And so so I agree that anxiety can be the symptom of PDA because what the person with PDA is doing when they are becoming avoidant is they're saying, I don't feel safe right now. And kind of subconsciously, their fight flight mechanism of their autonomic nervous system is being called upon to say, I need to be protected. And that could be anger, that could be like going into shutdown, right? It could be fight, flight, freeze, right? And so that's what's happening is we subconsciously, that autonomic nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system just says, nope, I need to protect, I'm disengaging. And so we have to find a way to help them feel comfortable and activate that parasympathetic nervous system, the other half that helps us feel calm, in order for everything to open up and allow the rest of the brain to come into play. And that's what equalizing does, right? It helps shift them from that sympathetic fight flight nervous system to the parasympathetic calm nervous system, where they can access, like it's like Monopoly, right? You can pass go to the rest of the brain when you're in a calm state. And so that's my sense of kind of how anxiety just shuts the door on the whole rest of the brain. And it doesn't matter what it's from, whether it's from an ADHD, whether it's from an autistic situation, whether it's from a lion chasing you, right? It just doesn't matter. You're gonna shut
Yeah.
down.
Or just from being activated all day because you're in a school environment that doesn't feel supportive or whatever.
Yeah.
That stress response, that sympathetic nervous system, that's a response that is pretty sensitive and that gets more sensitive as it's reinforced. So when you have a negative experience, you can probably think of an example like this that you've had for yourself. You have a negative experience. Every element of that experience is now negative for you. If you're in a car accident, every time that you pass that corner, you start to get activated. It's because the sympathetic nervous system, the amygdala, is remembering every single thing about that experience. And it's not saying, okay, there was a drunk driver there or whatever. It's not singling out the actual cause of the negative experience. It's just everything that was part of that experience is now in that same bucket. It's all part of negative aversive stimulus now. And I think young people, teenagers, have just an enormous number of aversive stimuli in their lives. And if you spend all day being activated in that way, yes, you're gonna look for ways to protect yourself, ways to escape from those aversive stimuli. And they're not always going to be rational. They're not always going to be aimed in the direction of the actual problem, especially for somebody who's young and whose nervous system is still developing.
And what I understand is our brains are wired to hold on to the negative much more strongly than the positive.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, any experience with a strong negative valence forms a very strong memory. Yeah, we could do a whole other hour just on the way that the memory system responds to the emotions. But yes, that's the basic idea.
All right, I'm going to ask the very, very last question and a rapid fire round because, and then thank you guys so much. This was so informative and so helpful. How do we go about being a pit crew when we ourselves could use a pit crew? I struggle with my own dopamine pathways and activation, which makes it incredibly challenging to monitor and regulate someone else's, especially the follow-through piece.
It's hard. It's hard. And it's about starting with identifying what are your underlying needs and maybe writing them down, right? What builds your ability to have energy for the day. And as like sometimes we have to use the spoon theory, but I also sometimes talk about battery life with people that I work with and with myself. Like, what do I need to do to recharge myself for what I have to do for the rest of the day to take care of kids, right? And so maybe it's modeling for my kids that it's okay to take time for me to recharge, right? And who's on our pit crew, right? Do I have friends? Do I have music? Do I have exercise? Do I have nutrition? Do I have sleep? Like, and kind of where is the pit crew that I haven't yet thought of, right? Like Real 2E could be part of your pit crew. um, and so, and how do I let go of, and I know this was a process for me in raising my twice exceptional child. Like, how do I express my own grief for the vision of the child that I thought I was going to have and the relationship I thought I was going to have, which I now do 7 years later, right? But like, how do I let go of the process that's evolving in order to embrace the the child that I have and the timeline that they're on and the interests that they have, and how can I join with them to decrease the resistance that I'm creating for myself also. That's a huge ask and that's a huge process. And it takes time for us to go through it. And I know I did a lot of, I'm going to hold it together now when I'm in communication, collaboratively, compassionately, curiously with my son. And then I'm going to go cry, or I'm going to talk with my friend and be like, I can't believe he did it again, right? Like, I'm going to allow myself to have the full human emotional experience so that it doesn't get stuck in my body, so that I need more of a pit crew in the medical community, right? But it was a process for me. It's a process for all of us to develop that acceptance and the coping mechanisms and finding that pit crew that we need internally, but also to surround ourselves with externally.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you for staying extra time, everyone. And I super appreciated this conversation and all of your expertise and coming at it from all the angles, but the way it wove together. And I hope everyone gets some sparks, blockers, new perspectives, and all
And
the
pit crews.
pit crews and gets the magnifying glass to become the detective. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for putting this together. I really appreciate being a part of it and hearing the questions that